Hi there everyone, today I'm reviewing Heroes, Legends, Champions, Why Heroism Matters by Andrew Bernstein. So why is heroism so important? It seems a kind of obvious or unnecessary question on the face of it. Why would we even need to look into the question of heroism? Surely the opposite's a criminal, a resentful person, or someone you would think is self-centered at everybody else's cost is never going to be worth looking up to. So why do we need to sort of assess the question of heroes? We clearly acknowledge and recognise what a hero is, from mythology, folk stories and lore, everyday life even, stories of heroism in the news. But this book posits that the departure from heroism, as evidenced with the popularity of anti-heroes, for example, or in media and books, or even a pervasive lack of purpose in society, points to some cultural and philosophical shift. Why are we using heroes less and less for inspiration, guidance, and to find purpose? I think the interesting dichotomy here is between the mythic and the real. Some would argue there isn't really a separation between the two. But when approaching heroism, are we looking at the rational, real-life angle or the spiritual meaning of heroism? Having written Objectivism in one lesson, an introduction to the philosophy of Ayn Rand, Bernstein clearly is probably going to fit into the former camp. With either angle though, what actually defines a hero? This is probably a good starting point. We all kind of know, but do we really know what it entails and means? Bernstein elucidates this, arriving at the following definition, and I open quote. A hero is a morally upright individual who, with ability and dauntlessness exceeding that of every man, confronts the obstacles and or dangers arising in pursuit of significant life-advancing goals, and who triumphs in at least a moral sense. End quote. So being heavily influenced by Ayn Rand, a certain portion of this book, and perhaps the most interesting, meets the debate of the self. Does a hero have to be benevolent and selfless to be heroic? The answer here is a resounding no. It argues that heroes sacrifice lesser values for the higher ones, but they have to maintain their higher, life-giving values. It might happen that benevolence and helping others happens as a happy coincidence of the pursuit of personal values, but that it is not the main objective or pursuit of a hero. Instead, the self-sacrifice is not of the self for other people, but it is self-fulfillment which might bring about good results for everyone. I agree partially with this. Benevolence seems, to my mind, to be a life-giving value, which is why it so often coincides with heroism. Sacrifices can and often are heroic, and are so when they are life-giving, as Bernstein acknowledges. And although self-fulfillment is indeed important, there are often heroic actions where someone makes a sacrifice that makes it heroic just because of what it is. A counterpoint given to this is that when someone gives to charity, they get a good feeling from it for themselves. But this can sometimes be a little reductionist in a lot of situations. When someone charges into battle, they aren't always thinking about personal glory. In fact, they're probably not. They might be thinking of their values, protecting their country, say, and so even then the sacrifice is heroic regardless of self-interest, and there's probably the denial of a lot of self-fulfillment. But I bet few people would say that such an action isn't heroic. In the section of the book most pertinent to this, Shakespeare is cited as an example, and that if he had not accomplished all of his amazing works, and instead looked after an ill relative, then it would be self-denying and not heroic, even though he is making a sacrifice. The argument is that the selfless action does not necessarily provide more benefit to humanity than if one life is saved, even though the one life saved is life-preserving. And remember, that's our criteria for the values of a hero, or part of that criteria. The aim is a rational cost-benefit analysis. What great feats of actions, art, science, mathematics would we lose if someone hadn't been heroic and instead focused on helping others to the detriment of these achievements that advance humanity as a whole? Is the priority to stick to a value or to be benevolent? The argument here then is clearly that benevolence is not of itself heroic. It depends on what values are held by the hero, of course, and what higher value is being supported and what lower value is being sacrificed. The hero, according to Bernstein, sticks to their higher values and may have to sacrifice things they love to get there. So it can appear quite cold at first impression, but from a definition standpoint, it makes more sense to construct an ordering of what is truly important when we are talking about a hero. Something has to define the hero and judge these debates of morality, and the argument made is that it is heroic life-supporting values that judge these cases. In other words, Shakespeare should focus on his plays and work because it confers more overall benefit to humanity, but also that it is him staying true to what is important to himself, rather than dropping it all to help somebody else, and thereby compromising his own values. Early on in the book, I raised my eyebrows at some of this, but it was elucidated more effectively towards the end. At first, my instinct was to say, well, of course the soldier is heroic sacrificing himself. And indeed he is, of course. Bernstein argues that when the soldier sacrifices himself, though, it's not because it's for other people. It's because it is in service to his own higher order, heroic, life-supporting value. I.e., it's a heroic act because the soldier is sticking to his heroic values in defence of his country. Whether you like this book might depend a bit on how coldly rational you think this interpretation is, or if you just think it's logical and makes sense. There has to be some kind of definition for a hero, and if you look at, for example, the Greek myths, it can become confusing due to the heroic flaws, Achilles being an obvious example, or Oedipus and his excessive pride. How do we define that which we are meant to hold up as a higher goal that is supposed to be the ideal way to act? Bernstein addresses this also. Heroes can pop up anywhere and aren't perfect. But we have to recognise that this makes them more human and relatable, and that we don't have to emulate everything about them. More importantly, we have to identify what makes them heroic and adopt that in our own lives, and that's probably why this book was written. So Bernstein's work was thoroughly engaging then. In a short space of time, I was really examining my own thoughts and beliefs about this. But it's not always as tight as I think it should be, especially for a really short book. I think it's about 160 pages. And doesn't even consider really the bridges between religion, mythology, modern times and heroism, instead choosing to push the Ayn Rand angle of self-fulfillment being the most important thing over all else, and particularly getting into the weeds with Marxism versus capitalism, which to be honest just felt jarring and unnecessary in this book with the heroic analysis. I'd even have liked to have seen the book approach the more spiritual side. For example, if self-fulfillment is of ultimate importance, and how to become what you should become is examined in religious and mythic stories, then it would make for a much more interesting analysis, rather than diverting to capitalism randomly. More time could have been spent on bringing out some of the more pernicious philosophical aspects. I find myself agreeing with a lot of the points, or at least I can understand the logic. Action is important for a hero, values are important. It argues that self-fulfillment is crucial if they are aimed correctly, because heroes become what they are supposed to become, even with their flaws. They stick to their values, which have to be life-giving, not necessarily benevolent, but for the betterment of humanity as a whole. But some of the heroic stories included in the book were not really related to very effectively. There's a lot of examples of stories, but almost some of them were a bit odd to include and didn't really get included in the argument. I wondered why one or two of them were even in there. And the departure to discussing Marxism just felt at odds with the rest of the book. So in terms of final score for this one, in conclusion, it is a good introduction to the idea of heroism, and a particular angle of Ayn Rand's philosophy. It's fairly concise and an easy read, and it did have some sections which I think could have been left out. But some parts were really engaging if you're interested in the topic, particularly the morality that I've talked about with sacrifice of lower or higher values and the soldier, for example. I think this is probably one for people really interested in these niches. It's probably not the kind of usual book that the everyday person's going to read, of course. It doesn't encounter the opposite angles of Ayn Rand, though, or surrounding context enough to my mind. But it might make you think about your own ideas of heroism. But you just have to be aware that really this is just pushing Ayn Rand's philosophy in a sense. So, in conclusion, I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10. It is a really good read. It just isn't quite broad enough in scope for my mind, even though it is pretty well argued and fairly concise. So, it's worth a read if you're interested in these topics. But for everyone else, it's probably a bit too niche. But 7 out of 10. I'm reviewing plenty of more books across a range of genres, so like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. Cheers.